the Honorable Paul Hellyer, formerly Minister of Defense of Canada, will be speaking about his experiences, his knowledge, and the way his mind has opened over the course of time. He's considered quite controversial by mainstream thinkers in Canada and elsewhere, and it's our joy to have him as part of our team here at the Breakthrough Conference. So, welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, which reminds me of something that General Eisenhower once said, that introductions like that are like chewing gum. It's okay to taste it for a few minutes, but for heaven's sake, don't swallow it. What would, incidentally, the title of my address this afternoon, and let me explain at the beginning that I have about an hour of things that I want to put on the record, and I'm going to plow through them. And then after that, it will be much more informal and more anecdotal, and there will be time at the end for questions and answers. And I was just reminded that if there is not sufficient time, then that there will be more tonight at the roundup. So what would you do if someone knocked on your door and said, your house is on fire? Would you say, not to worry? If it gets too bad, we'll wet a couple of blankets and smother it? Or would you have the common sense to say, call the fire department fast? That is exactly the situation that we are in today. The scientific indicators show that our earthly home is heating up at an alarming rate. And the consequences, as we have already begun to see, are as horrendous as they are unpredictable. Yet world leaders seem to be in denial of both the urgency and the magnitude of the danger. Instead, G20 leaders have spent most of their energy trying to rescue a handful of privately owned banks. Worse, they spend far too much time looking for new sources of oil to extend the present disastrous trajectory. So when people say, as they do almost daily, the world is in an awful mess, they're not only speaking the truth, but they are guilty of a masterful understatement. Just about everything we are doing is wrong, and almost every major policy must be reversed. Our leaders are steering toward a precipice, and just turning the wheel a little bit to the right or left won't save us. Only a U-turn will work. A complete reversal of just about every existing policy direction. Instead of drilling for more oil, building more pipelines, and approving more oil sands projects, we should be concentrating exclusively on the development of breakthrough clean energy, which is the main thrust of this wonderful conference. Well, it's exciting that there are so many knowledgeable experts here this weekend, and listening to them has been an education and an inspiration. My meager understanding has increased exponentially. However, I'm not an expert in the field and not qualified to talk about breakthrough energy. My expertise, to the extent that I have any, is politics, including foreign affairs and finance, specializing in money and banking. So my focus will be how to pay for the monumental shift away from the fossil fuels that we use today and replacing them with clean energy that is so vital to save our planet. Our present financial policies are disastrously inadequate Instead of asking taxpayers to accept punitive austerity to bail out greedy privately owned banks, governments should use their power to provide comparable relief to the powerless 99% who are struggling to keep their heads above water. The world banking and monetary system must be changed fundamentally for the benefit of all citizens and not just the privileged few. And the world's major religions must end their ageless animosities and start working together to build what I call the kingdom of God on earth. You can call it what you like, but I'm talking about a world where every child has adequate food to eat, potable water to drink, a decent shirt on his or her back, a roof over his or her head, adequate health care, and sufficient free education to develop skills and prepare for a productive and fulfilling life. Well, this kind of world cannot be achieved without a giant step forward in our spiritual evolution that requires sublimating ego in favor of service and concern for the welfare of others. The cult of corruption that has been sweeping around the world to reach epidemic proportions will have to be swept away by a code of ethics that breeds trustworthiness. The very difficult but essential revolution is a major moral revolution. And that is for each one of us to put into practice the one teaching that all of the major religious faiths have in common, and that is the Golden Rule. If you think about it carefully, there are few, if any, problems that could not be solved by each person and each country treating each other as we would want to be treated if the situations were reversed. To achieve a more just world of peace and prosperity, it will be essential for nation states to effect a massive change in priorities, especially the world powers. They must end the arms race and direct the hundreds of billions in savings to those pursuits that would enhance the quality of life for people everywhere. The highly educated military and scientific personnel who would no longer be needed to develop new weapon systems should be recruited for these same humanitarian projects, including, of course, joining the war against global warming for the benefit of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, as well as ours. While the cooperation of all major powers will be essential, it is the United States which has assumed the role of world leader that will have to take the initiative. When there are so many wonderful, honest, and dedicated people in the United States, it is difficult to comprehend how they could let their country drift so far from the principles on which the Republic was founded. General Eisenhower warned us to beware of the military-industrial complex, but a naive and complacent electorate paid no heed. They allowed a small group in the military, in collusion with the arms industry and Wall Street insiders, to take over effective governance of the country. Their motives were less than noble, with power and empire becoming their chief objectives. Well, when the Berlin Wall came down on November 9th, 1989, the elation on our side of the curtain was near universal, as one country after another regained its freedom. Nearly everyone believed that it was the dawn of a new era of peace and prosperity for people everywhere. There was much talk of a peace dividend. Without any military enemies of significance, the Western countries, and the US in particular, could reduce expenditures for armaments and divert the savings to myriad essential priorities, including healthcare, education, environmental protection, including sustainable growth, and the development of new sources of energy to replace fossil fuels. There would also be more money for the arts and the alleviation of poverty and illiteracy on a global basis. The prospects were simply dazzling. It was a unique and God-given opportunity for a new, braver, and fairer world. We blew it. We blew the chance of a lifetime to do good things. A small group of zealots undermined our golden opportunity to pursue peace, not war. Little did we dream that they had a very, very different vision of the New World Order. Their manifesto was a Pentagon document called Defense Planning Guidance on Post-War Cold War Strategy, dated February the 18th, 1992. It later became known as the Project for a New American Century. Item 6 on their list read as follows: in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, our overall objective is to remain the dominant outside power in the region and preserve U.S. and Western access to the region's oil. When a leaked copy of the document, prepared under the supervision of Paul Wolfowitz, then the Pentagon's Undersecretary for Policy, was disclosed by the New York Times in March 1992, the negative reaction from both the White House and foreign capitals was so strong that it had to be redrafted. The new, sanitized version adopted a much more conciliatory note. However, as someone who has long observed the techniques of creating politically acceptable language, and a sometimes practitioner of that craft, I would say that the principal difference between the first and revised drafts is in the weasel words. You cannot change a tiger by whitewashing its spots. The authors of this American Mein Kampf for Conquest recognized the difficulty of persuading sophisticated Americans to accept such a gigantic change in policy. So they wrote the following, quote, "Further, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary changes, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor." I understand that has been erased from the record recently, but it was there when I first wrote about it in a book some years ago. Well, it wasn't long before they got their catastrophic and catalyzing event. Terrorists struck the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington on September the 11th, 2001. The world was outraged. And for a few days, America had the sympathy of almost everyone, including the Islamic states. It was the kind of atmosphere where it would have been quite possible to uproot al-Qaeda with a police and intelligence operation. Instead, the cabal of military, industrial, banking, and intelligence interests decided to use the terrible tragedy as an excuse to launch their war on Iraq, even though there was not one shred of evidence that the Iraqis had been involved in the events of 9/11, either directly or indirectly. This was, in my opinion, the biggest strategic blunder in the history of the United States. As soon as the bombs began raining down on Baghdad from the relative safety of high-flying bombers, the sympathy of the Muslim world changed first to outrage and then to unbridled hate. The few terrorists that had existed before the war saw their number increase to a formidable army worldwide. Subsequent events in Pakistan and elsewhere have only exacerbated the situation for which there is no possible military solution. Period. For a just and peaceful world, then, the first difficult but essential step is a negotiated end to the war on terrorism. A good beginning would be for the U.S. Congress to renounce the plan for a new American century and to abandon the lust for empire. Then they should look at the root cause of the Muslim jihad. They don't have to look very far. Osama bin Laden spelled it out in very clear and unequivocal terms, and I quote, "Every Muslim must rise to defend his religion. The wind of faith is blowing, and the wind of change is blowing to remove evil from the peninsula of Muhammad, peace be upon him. As to America, I say to it and its people a few words. I swear to God that America will not live in peace before peace reigns in Palestine and before all the army of infidels depart the land of Muhammad, peace be upon him." Well, that is clear enough. The dislike of America had nothing to do with democracy versus dictatorship, or wealth, or freedom of religion and assembly. It is directly related to American foot-dragging in stick-handling a just settlement of the Palestinian question, while continuing to meddle in Middle Eastern affairs, including the stationing of troops on soil considered sacred to Islam. In short, American foreign policy was and remains the root of the conflict. Well, the U.S. will have to do an about-turn in order to end its decades-old practice of interfering in almost every country of any significance. But it would save them a lot of money and many U.S. and foreign lives if they began a new regime of genuine cooperation as a substitute for military and economic domination. This means a complete abandonment of their dark side, the greed and self-centeredness of their leaders, their false gods, their double standards, the increasing disparity in income between rich and poor, and finally, their callous attitude toward the poor and the powerless. These values, quote unquote, are not ones that should be exported to the world. They are part of a game plan that is not designed to provide the bread of life to starving millions, but to exploit and manipulate the many for the benefit of the elite few. Worse, they negate both democracy in the sense of rule by the people for the people, and the rule of law for which millions of patriots fought and died. So now it is the cult of interfering in other people's affairs that must die, and with it the notion of empire. When interference is essential for the peace of the world, it should be multilateral in nature and not unilateral and one-sided. This is particularly true in respect of a just settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Peace is possible, but only with a truly international consensus of what is just and fair for both of the parties directly involved. A just settlement would be the precursor to an end of the war on terrorism that would pave the way for an all-out worldwide attack on global warming, which is the number one problem facing humankind today. Well, a war against global warming provides a golden opportunity for all the world's diverse tribes, sects, religions, and nation-states to abandon their rivalries and work together as one big global family to protect the habitability of our common home. That is the reason this conference is so timely. We are looking at breakthrough energy sources to provide the alternative or alternatives to fossil fuels essential to launch the attack. As we have learned, multiple choices may be possible. To save precious time and money, we, the people of the world, should demand that the United States and other major powers disclose what they already know about exotic fuels. The answer is likely to be quite a lot. We should demand full disclosure, including what has been learned from visitors from other realms. In my latest book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, A Survival Plan for the Human Species, I quote someone who allegedly worked in one of the vast underground works the U.S. military have built in Nevada and Arizona. This source said that the cabal, as it is known, with the help of star visitors, had developed both zero-point and cold fusion energy. That was years ago, in the 1960s, in fact. And the source was not unique. Most ufologists that I know believe that the cabal, which is also known as the shadow government in the United States, is in possession of the technology we are looking for, but keep it secret for reasons of their own power and profit. So a good place to begin would be for the U.S. Congress to establish a small committee of scientific experts to examine the existing secret patents that have been filed with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Of the 10,158 secrecy orders for patents issued from 1942 to 1993, about 6,000 were still in effect in 1993, and it is almost certain that more have been issued since then. The committee should have the power to decide if their disclosure would be in the public interest, and if so, declare them to be in the public domain as part of the World Heritage. One thing is almost certain. The star visitors would give us the technology if we A, renounced the use of nuclear weapons and eliminated all plans to use them, and B, started treating them as genuine visitors rather than as enemy aliens. Once we identify the technology we need, and that should not take very long, the challenge will be to mobilize worldwide for the war on global warming. It will require a mobilization not too different from the one us old-timers witnessed in the 1940s. Just about every manufacturing plant, whether automobile, farm implement, or household appliance, was converted to the production of arms and ammunition. In this new world war, the opposite would occur. Just about every armaments factory would be converted to positive, peaceful uses. The goal would include converting or replacing the power source of every car, truck, tractor, airplane, home, and electrical generator now dependent on fossil fuels over a period of a few years. At the time my book was written in 2010, I estimated we had 10 years to accomplish all this. 2 years has already been lost, and the most important problem on Earth has been moved to the back burner by most of our leaders. As long as the G20 concentrate on patching up the Ponzi scheme known as the international banking and financial system, all hope is lost. Only a near-instant revolution of the mind and heart can save the day. Well, who will finance the war on global warming? Who will finance such a long, expensive war? That is the question that boggles the mind. We are talking about a worldwide technological revolution that will cost trillions of euros, dollars, pounds, rubles, yen, and so on. It will be the most expensive mobilization in the history of the planet. And it has to be done in the face of an unprecedented debt crisis. Many countries, including my own, I regret to say, are imposing austerity budgets in a painful attempt to shrink their economies to the point where they can pay the interest on their debt. But as the economy shrinks, the jobs begin to disappear. Unemployed people don't pay taxes, and require social assistance. At first, the jobless rebel. Later, they may take evasive measures, including migrating to places where there are jobs, to the extent that they exist in a world where the debt virus is epidemic. In fact, the existing international banking system is systematically destroying the Western world and impoverishing its people, with repercussions that spread like ripples around the planet. In 1980, the debt to GDP ratio in Greece was 22%. In 2010, it was 142%. In Spain, the ratio rose from 16.5% to 60%. In the same period, in Japan, the ratio rose from 51 to 220%. This unhappy result is not due to profligate spending by governments everywhere, although I admit freely that there are always pockets of waste that could be eliminated. It is because we have a financial system where more than 95% of all new money is put into circulation by privately owned banks as debt. It is debt that has to be repaid with interest, but no one creates any money with which to pay the interest. So the only way to pay it is to keep on borrowing more and more and going further and further into debt. Eventually, the debt burden gets too heavy to bear, so the economy collapses like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. History shows that our system is a perpetual disaster in the making. Well, how did such a system ever come about? It is because sovereign governments, as a matter of expediency, licensed privately owned banks to create money. For our purposes, it is sufficient to go back a little over 300 years to the time of King William of Orange. When he ran out of money for his continuing war with France, the English Parliament was unaccommodating. A new Whig government authorized the establishment of the Bank of England, which was incorporated in 1694. The rich people of London invested £1,200,000 in gold and silver and lent it all to the king at 8%, which is a pretty high interest rate for a guaranteed loan. To show his gratitude, the king gave the bank permission to print, P-R-I-N-T, £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend them to their friends at high interest rates. Thus, the king allowed the Bank of England to lend the same money twice, once to him and once to private borrowers. This was called leverage, and the leverage at that time was 2-to-1. It was also the beginning of the fractional reserve system of banking, under which banks were allowed to lend more money than they actually have in their vaults. Well, over the years, that leverage has increased dramatically. In the early 20th century, federally chartered banks in the United States were required to maintain 25% gold reserves. In other words, the banks were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. In Canada, when I was younger, the banks were required to maintain cash reserves of 8%. That meant that they were allowed to lend the same money 12.5 times. More recently, thanks to Milton Friedman's irrational flip-flop, from being someone who thought the banks should maintain 100% cash reserves to someone who was quite willing that they didn't maintain any cash reserves, multiples increased to as high as 20-to-1 or more, in what became the era of deregulated banking. Being able to lend the same money to 20 different people or institutions and collect interest from each one is not just larceny. It is grand larceny. Today, in most countries, banks don't have to maintain much in the way of cash reserves. In Canada, the requirement is 0. So you are lucky if your bank has a cent or a cent and a half in legal tender for every dollar you think you have in the bank. Instead of cash reserves, most banks operate under a system of capital reserves, or capital adequacy, as it's called. I call it capital inadequacy, with a formula laid down by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Since the meltdown of 2007-2008, capital requirements are being raised slightly to reduce the leverage of the banks, but they are still far, far too high. The leverage has to be reduced much, much more in order to create a stable system where bank failures won't occur. Still, you may ask, if banks lend money that they don't have in their vaults, where does it come from? Well, the answer really is that they create it out of thin air. The system works this way. Suppose that you want to borrow $35,000 to buy a car. You visit your friendly banker and ask for a loan. He or she will ask you for collateral, some stocks, bonds, a mortgage on your house or cottage, or failing any of those things, perhaps the co-signature of a friend or relative. And when the collateral requirement is met, the banker will ask you to sign a note for prime plus a certain amount, depending on the color of your eyes. And as soon as the note is signed, your banker will type something on their computer, and presto, the $35,000 will appear in your account, which you can go out and use to buy your car. The important point is that seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. Graham Towers, the first and arguably the best of the governors of the Bank of Canada, said, "Money is just a book entry. That's all it is." If he were alive today, he would say money is just a computer entry. That's all it is. So the bottom line is that there are literally millions of unemployed people around the globe for no better reason than lack of a few strategically placed computer entries. The fact that this is so is a crime against humanity in the literal sense of those words. The existing banking equation is a kind of double entry bookkeeping, where your note becomes an asset on the bank's books, and the new money that was deposited to your account is a liability. The profit for the bank comes from the difference between the low rate of interest, if any, you would receive if you left your $35,000 in the bank for a few months on the basis that the new models of cars might be better or be hybrid or whatever, and the much higher rate you would be obliged to pay on your note. The technical term is the spread. At some point, however, you have to pay off the note with interest. And anyone who defaults is in big trouble because you lose your collateral. You can lose your house, your cottage, your stocks and bonds, or your friendly friend. Governments, too, are in the same insidious position. They have to pay interest on their bonds and redeem them when they become due. In times of recession, when banks are reluctant to lend them any more money, especially at reasonable interest rates, they may have to call on the International Monetary Fund for help. That means accepting austerity measures that are definitely not in the interests of the people. One thing should be very clear. The IMF does not rescue countries. It rescues international banks. We are surrounded by evidence that a system based almost exclusively on debt is totally insane. Not surprisingly, there have been 25 recessions and depressions in the United States since 1890. In several cases, including the Great Depression of the 1930s and the current Great Recession, the evidence indicates that the meltdown was anticipated by a few insiders who helped trigger the catastrophe. In the wake of the Great Depression, the U.S. Senate Banking and Currency Committee report, that became widely known as the Pecora Report on the practices of stock exchanges, indicated that there were insiders who benefited from the crash. Quote, legal chicanery and pitch darkness were the bankers' stoutest allies, Pecora wrote in his memoir. Similar allegations were evident in Charles Ferguson's damning documentary Inside Job relating to the 2007-2008 meltdown. These reports and other historical evidence prove beyond any doubt that Wall Street has become one gigantic millstone around the neck of both the American and world economies. The collateral damage from the recent meltdown has been staggering. The U.S. Bureau of Labor estimated that 8.4 million jobs were lost in the U.S. alone. Most countries experienced similar dramatic losses. The reduction in asset values worldwide has been estimated at 20 trillion US dollars. Yet not a single one of the culprits is in jail. You would think that someone would have the decency to launch a class action for at least 10 trillion against every individual and every organization that contributed to the catastrophe in any way. This catastrophe should not have happened because governments own the patent to create money. The exception is the European Union, where nation-states have surrendered their monetary sovereignty. But privately owned banks have no rights, only privileges given by legislatures. Worse, banks don't even pay royalties. Still, governments go cap in hand to licensees when they are forced into deficit and accumulate too much debt. Excuse me. Why is this happening? We have become total captives of a small group of elite bankers who are trying to create a new world order under their control. The following lets you in on the secret. Why are governments paying private financiers to generate credit they could be issuing themselves, interest-free? According to Professor Carol Quigley, Bill Clinton's mentor at Georgetown University, it was all part of a concerted plan by a clique of international financiers. In his book, Tragedy and Hope, in 1966, he wrote, "The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings at conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations." If you'll excuse me for a minute, I think I'm going to have to take a cough drop here. I've been fighting this for 3 or 4 days, and I thought I had it almost licked, but it seems to be coming back. similarity of this declaration with one from David Rockefeller to a Bilderberger meeting at Baden-Baden in Germany is more than coincidence. And I quote, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries." End of quote. Well, if that was the plan, it has succeeded brilliantly. There is not one genuine democracy in the Western world. They are all being effectively dictated to by an international system of banks and bond dealers. Worse, there is no change in sight, because only about 1% of citizens understand what money is and where it comes from. Now, I'm not saying that all bankers are evil, because they are not, but the international financial system produces results that are evil beyond description. It has not always been and doesn't need to be this way. There is a remedy. So there are solutions, both short and long-term objectives. First and most urgent, the world, and especially the Western world, needs a massive infusion of government-created debt-free money to end the recession/depression. A figure of 10 trillion US dollars equivalent might be, a reasonable place to start. Once it has been spent into circulation by governments, it will be possible to assess what remains to be done in the short term. Will it work to restore the vitality of economies worldwide? Absolutely. In 1938, there were no jobs in Canada. None. Then the war came along, and the Bank of Canada came out of hibernation and rode to the rescue. It created very large sums for the government of Canada at near zero cost. The government spent the money into circulation, and soon everyone was working or in the armed forces. Unemployment dropped to an historic low of 1%. The longer-term objective includes putting some semblance of morality back into the system. It is essential that we stop banks from lending the same money to so many people or institutions and collecting interest from each. So I'm proposing a gradual reduction in bank leverage from its indecently high multiples to a point where their interest-bearing assets would not be greater than 2 times the cash in their vaults or on deposit with their central bank. This could be achieved in 10 years or less by federal governments creating enough government-created money to keep the economy growing while at the same time buying back about 1/3 of their outstanding debt. Once banks have achieved 34% cash reserves, and this incidentally means that the current system of capital adequacy has to be completely abandoned and replaced with a much more effective cash reserve system, new money creation would be shared 34% by governments and 66% by private banks. The biggest achievement of the whole process would be the re-democratization of the so-called democracies. At present, nearly every country, including the United States, Canada, and European countries, are victims of the autocratic private banking system. It goes without saying that central banks would have to be 100% publicly owned, so that the profit that accrues from printing money would be public profit rather than private profit. Ironically, it is just 100 years ago that the international banking cartel pulled the wool over the eyes of a sleeping U.S. Congress and persuaded it to delegate the sovereign right of the United States to create money to the Federal Reserve System, the Fed, that is privately owned. The Fed has probably caused more damage than any other financial institution in history and has played a major part by its implementation of monetarism and the ideas of Milton Friedman in the huge buildup of debt worldwide since 1980. So it either has to be nationalized or wound up and replaced with a proper Bank of the United States that is owned by the people of the United States. Well, the principal myth that is circulated about government-created money is that it's more inflationary than bank-created money. The fact is that money is money, and one is no more or less inflationary than the other, provided, of course, that the government-created money cannot be leveraged by the private banks to a greater extent than the new system would provide for. So some monetary reformers ask why, if government-created money is such a good thing, that the public share shouldn't be 100% instead of 34%. On this particular point, Milton Friedman was right. He claimed that a 100% cash reserve system was not politically feasible. I agree, it is not. But even if it were, I would not want to give politicians a free hand with the printing presses. A 34% share will solve government's number one problem of balancing their budgets and providing the legitimate services that citizens deserve. Similarly, I think a leverage of 2-to-1 is enough to allow banks to carry on as legitimate businesses and profitable businesses and do the things that banks should do and are expected to do, without providing them the leeway of running worldwide casinos as they have been in recent decades. Finally, one has to wonder why the G20 group of world leaders hasn't come up with something positive along these lines. One can only assume that none of them has a specialized knowledge in the field of money and banking. And this is not surprising when, as I said, only about 1% of the people understand how it really works. Instead, the leaders are advised by bankers and economists. The former are part of the cartel and represent the vested interests of the banking fraternity. Orthodox economists, with a few rare exceptions, and there are some, lack the necessary vision. They have known full well that the balanced budget approach adopted in the 1930s only succeeded in extending the misery for several years. They have had 70 years to design a system that would be a firewall against a recurrence, but they haven't done it. So, we will have to seek out the handful of forward thinkers who do understand and put them in positions of authority. I have one candidate in mind. She spoke on economics here at the conference just a day or so ago. It was Einstein who said, "The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results." Well, that is what governments, on the advice of their chief economists, are doing today. It should be perfectly obvious that the status quo will not solve the world's major problems, such as the unconscionably high levels of unemployment, or the urgent need to stop global warming before it is too late. Radical and dramatic changes in policy provide the only hope. Well, in this context, the re-election of Barack Obama is the best possible result for both the United States and the world. He is the first U.S. president to survive the curse of a Wall Street-inspired economic depression. Historically, the incumbent president is held directly responsible rather than the perpetrators of the crime. Free of the curse, and without the necessity of worrying about another election, Obama can begin the incredibly difficult reforms essential for the health and welfare of all the world's people, rich and poor alike. He should start by defanging Wall Street. Its ironclad arm lock on the world power structure must be broken. To accomplish this, he will have to say, quote, farewell and God bless, end of quote, to his whole coterie of financial advisors, including his Secretary of the Treasury. When Obama was first elected and I saw a picture of his financial economic advisors, I cried internally. The very people responsible for the incredible economic mess had surrounded and taken control of the president. They would rescue the banks and leave the rest of the economy in a shambles, I thought, because they really don't know what to do and had insufficient incentive to innovate. Such a catastrophe should not be allowed to happen again. In order to facilitate change, the Congress will have to pass a law making it a criminal offense for any bank or financial institution to contribute to any politician or candidate for political office without long jail terms for any breaches of the law. Any congressman or congresswoman who puts the interests of their electors first would surely support such a law. Once Wall Street's power had been broken and the common sense monetary system put in place, the president would be in a position to start addressing the other areas in most urgent need of attention. They include an end to the war on terrorism, a just settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian crisis as a precondition for peace, full disclosure of the extraterrestrial presence and technology, including the extent to which new energy sources have been developed, a campaign to save the rainforests, to protect them fully, and a massive reforestation program that must be instigated. And finally, global resources must be fully mobilized to replace fossil fuels with breakthrough energy solutions before it is too late to protect our children and their children. Well, this next line, time does not permit any further elaboration of the high priority reforms that must be vigorously tackled. But I've already written about them in greater length in Light at the End of the Tunnel. The Global Breakthrough Energy Conference has shown that we can abandon fossil fuels in favor of clean energy. That puts the onus on us. Will we unite with the visionaries around the world to preserve its habitability for future generations or not? The choice, dear friends and gentle hearts, is ours. So that ends my formal discourse. And let's see, probably take 15 or 20 minutes, Mitchell, if that's okay, on the other things that have come into my mind. And I originally thought there was going to be a break between the two hours, but apparently there isn't, so we'll just carry on. No, I think we'll carry on because we want to try and catch up a little time and get back on schedule. Today in my country, we celebrate Armistice Day. And it is based on the end of the First World War in 1918, when on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, which is today, the armistice was signed. And each year we stop and pause. And I would like, if you don't mind, just taking 2 minutes of silence, which we would observe if we were at home, to remember the people that died everywhere without trying to differentiate, because most of them thought they were fighting for something in which they believed. So if you will join me for 2 minutes of silence, then we'll carry on. Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to tell you briefly a little bit about my long-term interest in the subject of money and banking. When I went to university after the war, I found that my favorite subject was economics. And I asked my professors if recessions and depressions were necessary. And I didn't like their answers. What they said, in effect, was, read your economic history. There have been recessions and depressions, and so by extension, there will continue to be recessions and depressions. And I thought that didn't make a lot of sense. So I spent my own time reading various people, including the Chicago School of the time, and Irving Fisher and others, and came to the conclusion that there had never been a recession or depression that was necessary, not one. They were all monetary phenomena, and all could have been avoided with a system that made any sense. So in 1948, all of the economists said there's going to be another Great Depression in 1950. So I said, well, there doesn't need to be. Got to try and do something about this. Got to try and get elected, which I did. And despite impossible odds, was elected to the House of Commons in 1949. But then in 1950, what happened? What happened, of course, was the Korean War. And so the big powers, or powers involved in the Korean War, borrowed more money in order to equip themselves to fight that war. And as a result, the Depression never happened. By the time the Korean War was over, nearly everyone was a Keynesian. When I had arrived in Ottawa, there were only a handful of Keynesians, but by 1970, everyone was a Keynesian, including Richard Nixon. The system seemed to work fairly well until the 60s and 70s, when we began to see a bit of inflation and stagflation. And that was when people started taking interest in saying something wrong with the system as it's working. I went to see Gunnar Myrdal, who coined the phrase stagflation, and he said he coined the phrase, but he didn't understand it. Didn't understand what it was. Well, it wasn't very complicated. What was happening was that a new phenomenon had arisen when, as a result of market power, powerful unions and powerful companies were influencing the price structure by using their market power. And unions started demanding and getting wage increases that were miles away from the productivity. Productivity in Canada and the United States at the time, I think, was running around, by productivity, I mean the output in physical goods and services per person in the labor force per year, the increase, was in the range of 1%. But we started getting increases of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% a year and more. And all this did was to push up costs. I think it was Professor Stiglitz that said that labor costs are 65% of direct and indirect costs. And so prices were going up really by the increase in nominal pay and the increase in physical output. And I did some tables on this, 3 in fact over a period of years, for 18 OECD countries, and that formula worked out within 0.25% on average. So this, I guess, gave Milton Friedman inspiration to try and figure out what had gone wrong, and he did his study, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of looking at 100 countries over 100 years, and coming to the conclusion that prices had risen corresponding to the increase in the money supply. Well, that was technically true, but what it didn't tell you other things. I said it was like saying that for 100 years, in 100 countries, summer had followed winter. But it didn't show you whether the summer was dry, whether it was wet, whether it was good for crops, whether it was bad for crops, or anything else that you had to know to get the whole picture. And so he came up with this idea of crushing the monetary system in order to stop what he perceived as being classical inflation of too much money chasing too few goods, when in fact that is not what the problem was. And his disciples, starting, I guess, with Paul Volcker, decided to put his theory to the test. And in 1980-81, Volcker, after some fiddling around with the system, raised interest rates to something like 18%. And in Canada, Governor Bowie of the Bank of Canada raised them to 22%. And they crushed the economy, and they crushed the life out of it. They put millions of people out of work, out of their homes, off their farms, sometimes after several generations, and put them out of business so they couldn't pay taxes, and really made a mess of the economy. In retrospect, they could have accomplished more. They could have reduced inflation more by a 12-month wage price freeze that applied to just about everything except commodities. But that was not part of the thing. And what Friedman had failed to recognize was that for 25 years in a row, the inflation had been due to primarily, not to the Vietnam War, as the textbooks say, not to the blip in oil prices, but primarily to increases in labor unit costs. Because nominal wages had risen by a multiple, mind you, of productivity for more than 25 years in a row, and it still hasn't made its way into the textbooks. So consequently, the central banks of the world decided to take on the role of policemen for inflation. And they really knocked you know what out of the economy in 81. I mean, there were some winners like myself. I bought a condo in Toronto, and that in 81 for cost. But not everyone was so fortunate. Then something else happened too. He found that a number of South American countries were not able to pay their debt at the new higher interest rates. And that technically all the big New York banks were broke. And they were planning not to lend any more money to these countries. So he got them all in a room and locked the door and wouldn't let them out until they promised to lend more money to make it look as if these were performing loans rather than non-performing loans until he could get the IMF to ride to the rescue. And thus began this horrible stretch of IMF rescues, quote unquote. And it worked so well there, they used it in Southeast Asia, and they've been using it all over the world since. Well, in Canada, in 1974, we were admitted to the small group of policymakers at the Bank for International Settlements. And at that first meeting where we were included, they took a decision, A, to adopt the ideas of Milton Friedman and consequently bring on these periodic recessions, and B, not to lend governments any more money at low cost. And it's been downhill ever since. In 1974, there was not a single food bank in all of Canada. Today, there are over 800. And I attribute the whole disaster to getting the theory wrong, prescribing the wrong medicine, prescribing a medicine where the cure was worse than the disease. And so we've got to do something that's rational for a change. And this has all been irrational. The Bank of Canada used to lend the Government of Canada low-cost money. It stopped in 1974 and made us borrow in the market at high interest rates. And so they brought on the recession of a little one in 74, a big one in 80, 81, another big one in 1990, followed by the big meltdown in 2007, 2008. The economy goes to pieces, the government's revenues fall, and their expenses rise because of all the damage that's been done. And so the deficit is rolled over into debt. In 1980-81, the debt to GDP ratios for Canada and the US had been almost flat for 35 years, and they just started going up like a skyrocket. And that was the origin of the, what I would call debt ceiling that we're in today. So there are reasons for these things, the reasons that we got into this mess. And so we have to now deal with the consequences of some very bad policy over a very long period of time. And what I'm going to take 5 minutes to tell you what I've proposed for our country by way of reform. Most of it I've already mentioned, but there's one specific thing that I'd like to mention, and then we'll go to questions. We had an austerity budget in the fall, which was really a toughie. Thousands and thousands of people put out of work. Many very worthwhile programs cut back, and just the kind of thing you really don't want to see because they're anti-human. And so I proposed that instead of doing that, and I was joined with a number of collaborators, including, I don't know, Ellen Brown, who wrote Web of Debt. I'm sure you're familiar with that book. And if you're not, and you want to understand this business, you should get a copy of Web of Debt by Ellen Brown and read the first 100 pages. And they were right behind me in this. So I proposed that the government print 15 $10 billion share certificates in Canada. Non-redeemable, non-transferable, and hand them to the Bank of Canada as collateral for a $150 billion cash infusion. To be split 50-50 with the provinces, who then would be expected to pass some down to the municipalities, so that all of the stuff and nonsense that you've seen in your own cities and your own states, those of you from America, and that we have seen in Canada, can be reversed and start to put a little bit of life back in the economy and a little common sense back into our system. This is the only unique thing that I have really talked about. The rest of all this stuff has been around for generations. The problem is, so far, we haven't done anything about it. We talk about it. We talked about it 100 years ago, and then we get a war, and we have more or less good times for a while, and it seems to go out of the public consciousness. But we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that a permanent remedy must be found. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I think the debt worldwide is high enough, and that it should never go another cent higher. And so what we do has to put a cap on the world debt and individual country debts in the short run. And then, as we increase the cash reserve requirements of the banks and pay off debt, that it will be a downward path instead of the perpetual upward path that it's been for so long. So that is really what I've been proposing, and I think that's about all I want to say until we take some questions, and I have maybe one little final thing to say later. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for elucidating these matters that are tricky and usually over our heads. So, questions, comments? Do we have a roaming mic?
Thank you very much for your wonderful speech. I would like to ask you if you could comment on the AMERO and the North American trade. Bush signed a few years this agreement effectively ending sovereignty for US, Mexico, and Canada.
I'm not hearing. Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm aware of it. And we'll do anything short of going to jail to stop it if I can.
Is it sort of the end play of the big Ponzi scheme in your eyes?
I'm sorry?
Is it sort of the end game of the big Ponzi scheme?
Is it the end game of a big Ponzi scheme?
It's the end game of a control scheme. Because just as a few people took control of Europe, this is some of the same people saying we're going to grab Canada and Mexico and put them under the control of the US cabal. And in the future, the cabal will decide how much we increase their money supply and whether they have unemployment or prosperity. And they will lose that right because they will have given it up. And having seen what happened in Europe, anybody should be desperately against this. Now, there is a solution. You could still maintain the euro if the treaty was changed so that the European Central Bank could take some shares, like the ones I described, from each member of the Union, of the Euro Union, and print money and say, here you are. Use it to help your people, to create jobs, to fight global warming, to do whatever you want to do with it. Pay off some of your debt. If the European Central Bank would do that on a proportionate basis for population, then you could make the Euro system work and keep it from flying apart. Without something like that, the chances of it working indefinitely is very small, because as long as you're on this debt treadmill, I mean, how many times are you going to bail out Greece and so on, and Ireland? It doesn't matter who, because the system is loaded against you. You're trying to do the impossible by bailing out of a debt trap by borrowing, and you can't do it. The system fundamentally, just look at it this way, more than 95% of all new money is created as debt. So mathematically, the debt in the world is headed toward infinity. Where's it going to end? In one of my books, I projected the debt of the United States, and if it just keeps on going like it is, I was just guessing, but the US debt will go to 50 trillion. And the burden gets to the point where ultimately, the people just will take to the streets. And unfortunately, the cabal are sort of looking forward to that and preparing against it. But the present system is fundamentally unsound. Mathematically, it doesn't make any sense. And a high school student can see that where all of the money is created as debt, on which interest has to be paid, that you have a debt burden that's just going to keep going up and up and up until it crashes.
Thank you. I also would have to say this was a really excellent presentation. I'm trying to actually think with you if you succeed in basically injecting the 150 billion into your economy from a free energy perspective. Because in my view, with what I learned yesterday from free energy, I can see a world in front of me where decentralized power producers, they've in fact become independent power producers, right? And I also learned yesterday that free energy can produce more electricity than individual consumers would need. So the way to enable this, if you inject money in an economy and you would give these independent power producers in fact a feed-in tariff with which they could actually earn money, in excess of their own needs, then probably you could solve a few problems at once. And my question is, what do you think about this?
I'm sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing. I don't know whether one of my batteries is dead or not, but can you help me out here again?
Could you consolidate that in one simple question?
Yeah, helping households by being power producers with free energy could be to develop a system where actually these households earn money if they feed electricity into the system.
Well, I thought we're not going to let them feed into a grid, that they're just going to look after their own needs, and that's the whole idea of getting away from international grids with all of their dangerous aspects.
And centralization.
And centralization. And consequently, I don't think money is going to lose its place. But they're two separate issues as far as I'm concerned. But as far as I'm concerned, I would love to see every household independent as far as its energy supply is concerned. And what they do in their day jobs, that's something else. But I don't want to get away from this system that somebody was describing so well for us, where we're totally reliant on the slightest little mishap somewhere, some little accident that would shut down the whole system, and presumably would shut down the whole system, whether it had a 100,000 sources or whether it has 100 sources. So I don't want to go from what I would say is almost bad to worse. I would like to say, let's get rid of the big generators. Let's get rid of those horrid long lines going across the world that are putting out electromagnetic fields that are having negative effects on people. And let us install small independent machines, if we can, in our cars, in our trucks, in our houses, and be as independent and work from that point of view.
Beautiful.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to add here the old notion of one of the original Rothschilds who said, "He who controls the money controls the world or society." And now it's become he or she who controls electricity, i.e. power, controls the world. So there's been this morphing, and I think one of the subjects that's been in circulation here very clearly has been this issue of centralized power, because on one hand the power is electricity, and the other one it's the power of economy and politics, all wrapped up in one.
This would become a discussion, so I don't think it's, good to do it here, but because we would run out of time. But I think there could be intermediate forms in this, but let's take that later on at some point.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Paul will be on tonight's panel, and certainly bring it up, and we'll have a lively discussion. If there are other questions, thank you, Ron. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Steve Crosswick. I would like to add to the mix some information from a book I read, which is called Babylon's Banksters. I forgot the author's name for the moment. Joseph Farrell. In that, there's a lot of interesting information about the meta-dimensional or hyper-dimensional aspects of banking or money itself. So I'm not totally convinced that it will be interesting, but I can feel somewhere that there might be a different way of financial mathematics, maybe resonant mathematics, that we can apply to these huge debts in order to look at them from a different angle, from a different perspective, and do something very positive with them. So, in general, I'm intrigued by this idea that there's also a free energy equivalent of financial systems that we could apply to this inherited debt structure.
It's called the delete button on the keyboard.
Well, no, it's more. I understand. Yeah. Well, it seems that if we apply resonant or more elegant financial mathematics, that we can adopt, and I know how controversial this may sound, but we can adopt an attitude of gratitude towards this era of debt. This era of debt.
No, I didn't quite get.
Okay. All right. I'll do my best to summarize and synthesize the question. It was an elaborate question with many points to it, but in general, is there a form of mathematics that could be applied to the current debt situation? And I won't even call it crisis, but situation, because he sees that there's a possible upside in the current apparently downside of such heavy debt. Is there a form of mathematics that could be applied that could show the quality or the goodness of our current situation?
I don't think there's any goodness to it, but let me tell you the most hopeful thing, and this is one of the sign of hope that I thought I'd try and bring in. And I'd like you to write down the name of the author and get the article and maybe start your investigation from there. This is IMF's epic plan to conjure away debt and dethrone bankers. Now, I had some nasty things to say about the IMF earlier, and I'm not going to retract them because they're well-deserved. And I could spend more time on that if I had more time to do it. But putting out this paper is good. And let me just read a couple of things. The conjuring trick is to replace our system of private bank-created money roughly 97% of the money supply was state-created money. And it go back to a historical point before Charles II. And the nation regains sovereign control over the money supply. There are no more bank runs and fewer boom-bust credit cycles, according to the authors of this. Now, this was printed in the Telegraph just about 2 days before I left to come on this trip, which is an extensive one. And it goes back to the original Chicago School of the 1930s, where they were discussing the same things that we are now. So there's been very little progress since. What they are really suggesting here, in my opinion, there are two good things about it. First, they are establishing the point that governments have A, the responsibility, and B, the power to do something. Now that's new. I haven't seen those ideas in any major newspaper for years. To say governments have the power and the responsibility to act. Now, if they did what was suggested here and converted all of the debt to cash overnight, it would wreck the system. Because there would be too much cash floating around, and it would disrupt all of the investment portfolios, the pension plans, and everything else. Whereas the approach that I suggested was a gradual one. I call it principle with prudence. You start out by getting the economy up and running again so that people start working, paying taxes, deficits stop going down, and you start a permanent system of governments supplementing their income by means other than taxation, direct taxation. It is a form of taxation, but it's not direct taxation. So it's another way of getting a piece of the pie to spread around and do worthwhile things with. And if you do it, if you establish the principle that they're putting forward here, then you can start working on a workable system. If you were to take this plan that is put forward, and I'm sure by Benes, B-E-N-E-S, and Kumhof, K-U-M-H-O-F, if you put it into effect overnight, it would have an absolutely disastrous effect. But that's not what we're looking for. We want the principle of governments taking responsibility and of doing something, and then of doing it. And then doing it in tranches and slices necessary to have continuous improvement until we get the system to the point where the power of the banking cartel is gone forever. That's what we want. And I don't know of any other way to do it, because people have been looking at this, as I said, this plan was, the original one was devised 100 years ago. Well, not quite, in the 1930s, so it's 80 years ago. It was the plan that Milton Friedman studied first. The people that wrote the original plan were the mentors of Milton Friedman, which he freely admitted. But then he came up against this wall of an impossible political situation. And I think he figured it right. You couldn't get away with it. You can't get away with it, so why try? The irrational thing is that he went from 100% cash reserves to zero. That doesn't make any sense. I wrote him and asked him why he did that. And you know what his answer was? To keep government out of it. What do you think he was thinking rolling over in his grave at the extent of government intervention to save those banks in 2007, 2008? Do you think he still thinks that it's impossible to have government out of it? There's no way. Government has to be in it, because this is not a private thing. This isn't growing pumpkins or making bicycles. This is a sovereign right of the sovereign in the old days, but now of the government, the highest government level, to create money, to keep the system working. not too much, or you have inflation. Not too little, or you have high unemployment. You have to get the right. It's something like learning to fly. You don't pull back on the stick too much, or whoops. And you don't push forward too far, or whoops. And what you want to get is straight and level. And if you take the best from that, if Milton had stopped, say, at 50%, 30%, 70%, anything, I could have understood it. But what he proposed didn't make any sense at all to me. I think he's done a terrible disservice to the people of the world with his ideas. And I think the sooner we forget them and get on with better ones, the better off we're all going to be.
We have time for one more question, if you would like. Yes. Yes, I did. Yeah, the man with the hand up.
Hello. Could you maybe comment on the importance of oil for the dollar and international stability? And wouldn't a breakthrough energy also pose maybe a financial risk for possibly financial collapse because of the importance of fossil fuels in also for financing? Thank you.
Let me see if I understand. Is there a danger of financial collapse from shifting from fossil fuels?
Well, the petrodollar to, let's say, a free dollar, a free energy dollar, or something of that sort.
Well,
how would it impact our economy to go from one to the other?
A couple of things. I have two books that you can get from Amazon. One is Light at the End of the Tunnel, and a survival plan for the human species. And the other one is A Miracle in Waiting, Common Sense Economics, or economics that makes sense, I think. And I deal with this question. There should not be any single world currency controlled from one country. The United States has had a free ride for years. They know it. And that's the reason they're doing a lot of things to try and keep it going, because you can print money and let people in the world pick it up as reserve currency, and you can live off the avails, as the saying goes. We should have a world currency, and in my book I recommend one, not the one that the cabal has in mind for us, that they control, which is the wrong way to go, but one that a genuine bank for international settlements, a genuine bank, maybe a currency called uni, where currencies were freely transferable either from any currency to any other currency, or from any currency into gold at market rates, and where the backing of the uni was represented by currencies from every country on earth that participated in the system, so that everybody's in it. And that is what I think is the only safe way to go. I think it's the only equitable way to go. I think it is progressive a way to go, and then we wouldn't have people worrying about who is, whether we were going to lose the oil dollar in favor of a food dollar. I think someone was suggesting yesterday, or new energy dollar, or any other kind of dollar. A dollar's a dollar. And unless you convert it into a uni, which would be what you'd carry with you if you were traveling abroad, and using it to buy things in the local shops that they would take in exchange for their goods and services. So there are all kinds of things that have to be done, or should be done. It would be nice if they were done. And I list a whole bunch of them there, but they would take hours to talk about. And we haven't got time to do that. And I just...
The book.
Yeah, get the book. But I would recommend that you try and get this article from the Guardian. And I recommend two books if you're interested in the subject, really. One is Web of Debt by Ellen Hodgson Brown. And just read the first 100 pages. And then if you want to know how the banks are cheating us by moving money offshore so that the rich people and the rich corporations don't pay tax, there's a book called Treasure Islands. Islands Plural by Michael Shaxson. And it will really upset you to read it, but you should read it so that you know what's going on in the real world and not just the pretend world. And this is all something that we can bring back under control if we break the power of the cabal and of the cartel. Final thing I have to say is that I would like to thank Joran and Robert and their amazing group of volunteers for putting together this conference. It's been so wonderful in so many ways, so inspirational, so educational, and giving heart to all of us to see that we have like-minded people from around the world who want to get together and change the old paradigm and come up with one. And so I'd like to thank them. There are two, my website, in case I ever get it properly up to date, is paulhellierweb.com. That's paulhellierweb.com. And there's another one that the monetary reformers have been using, because I'm not alone in this, there are a lot of people in this. And that's victoryfortheworld.net. Victoryfortheworld, all one word, .net. And if we haven't got it right at the moment, we're going to have it right within a matter of a few weeks. And that'll be a good place to go and find out who's who and what's coming up next in the world of monetary reform. So that is the final thing I have to say, except let's go home and take our ideas and fight for them with passion and emotion and really make a difference, because each person can make a difference. They can influence one other person. And if enough of us do it, then, in fact, we can change society and get the kind of world that we all want to see for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, the Honorable Paul Hellyer. That was a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it.